I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to this seminar to Behold the Throne, an introduction to Merkavah Mysticism. This lecture series is possible because of the generous support of the patrons of this channel. In fact, this entire channel is an experiment in crowd-funded university-level education made accessible completely for free. Open access, no paywalls. Access to reliable scholarly education on any topic shouldn't plunge anybody into thousands of dollars of debt, and I'm committed to making topics that I have expertise in and the history of Western esotericism as accessible to the public as possible. That said, if you benefit from the channel or from this course, I'd ask you to please consider supporting the channel for the production of free courses like this via a yearly contribution to my Patreon for as little as like $54 a year. It's basically a cup of coffee a month. But I genuinely appreciate your consideration for supporting this channel and making this kind of educational content possible. But to be clear, I am grateful for the work that I'm able to do, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this open access seminar, To Behold the Throne, an introduction to Merkavah Mysticism. And everyone, welcome back to what is now the penultimate lecture in this series, which is somewhat sad to say that it's a penultimate lecture. And as I was saying before we started the recording, I looked out this window when I first started this, and it was a heat wave. And now I'm looking out this window, and I'm watching snow come down, which tells us that we've been on quite a journey with the Descenders. But I think a fascinating journey, and a journey that they merit our study. So I'm glad that we've had the opportunity to visit with them. But as we turn today to a dimension of the Descenders and their world that we haven't touched on yet, and I think it's conspicuous that that it's worth mentioning, especially in the context of this course being offered here on the channel Esoterica, and that, of course, is the magical context of the descent literature. For folks who are familiar with magic in the Eastern Mediterranean world, late classical magic of the Mediterranean world, you can think the Greek magical papyri. Anyone who's ever looked at that literature, if you've ever had the chance to look through the Betz edition of the Greek magical papyri, you'll notice that there's a lot of similarities with the magical literature preserved in the Demotic papyri, the Greek magical papyri. There's a lot of overlap with that literature and the Hekhalot literature. And so to say that there is, in some sense, an overlap with the mysticism of the descent and the magic that was practiced in the late classical world, I think should be relatively obvious. I mean, if you've ever read the Hekhalot Zutarti, which I hope many of you have at this point, it is just filled to the brim with adjurations. And those adjurations have a kind of mechanical effect. If you do this, this will happen. So there is an overlap between magic and mysticism. And of course, we shouldn't separate those in some radical way. Magic, mysticism, religion all exist as some kind of spectrum. And this magical quality of the Hekhalot literature is, I think, worthy of an investigation. In fact, I think it would be worthy of an entire dissertation. To my knowledge, that dissertation does not exist yet, but I think that it would merit a full monograph, at least a whole monograph. But in three ways, I would argue that the literature, the Hekhalot literature, overlaps with the magical literature of the late classical world. Specifically, I said, the Eastern Mediterranean magical traditions. The first of those, of course, is spirit adjurations. And spirit adjurations are everywhere in the late classical world. We find them specifically in the Hekhalot literature, although rather than dealing with spirits in a more abstract way, we're dealing with angels typically, right? So it's mostly angelic adjurations, specifically of the Sar Torah, but also of other angels, a wide panoply of angels, as we've seen over the course of this series. Further, one of the mechanisms that you interact with these entities is through the use of seals that feature nomina barbara. So there are various kinds of seals, everything from a signet ring all the way up to single words that are used as seals. And these words, for reasons that are not terribly clear to us, seem to have a kind of efficacious power over the angels. So if you encounter an angel and you have a specific seal, often their name in a seal form, you either show them the seal or you somehow otherwise you maybe speak the seal. But by speaking or showing them the seal, this seems to have an effect on them. It seems to compel them to action, or at least prevent them from doing things to you, specifically killing you in some kind of horrific way, if we are to see the angels of the world of the Hekhalot. So that's the second, is these seals featuring nomina barbara. And of course, the third is ascent technologies. right? And ascent technologies are shared among lots of different groups in the Eastern Mediterranean. You can think of the world of the Hermeticists and their ascent technologies. Christianity is an ascent technology. Basically, Jesus is sort of the first, one to make it out, and he leads the way. Paul really understands having faith in that ascent, Jesus's ascent. So Christianity, I think, begins in many ways as one of these ascent technologies. We can see them in Gnosticism. We can see them in all as far back as the old Egyptian religion. So this is part of a larger group of ascent technologies, of which the Hekhalot literature is a species. Now, of course, it's a descent, but again, ascent, descent. In a sufficiently infinite space, there's ascents and descents are indistinguishable. So something similar there. But what I think is most conspicuous about the Hekhalot literature is that, to my knowledge, and with a couple of exceptions that we'll talk about in just a moment, Hekhalot literature seems to combine all of these in a way that you don't see them combined in other texts. That is to say, spirit adjurations, the use of seals and nomina barbara, we might say magic, and an ascent technology all wrap up into one mystical, magical system. So here, in many ways, we can think of the Hekhalot literature as conspicuous and interesting because it combines both religion, Judaism, mysticism, Merkavah mysticism, and Hekhalot literature as magic into one thing. And so in this way, it's conspicuous. So that's just an interesting aspect of all of this. But of course, the greatest collection of magic from this time period is the PGM, the Greek magical papyri, of which is collected in the translation of Betz, which unfortunately is not terribly reliable and it's going to need to be redone at some point. But this is where we can begin to compare some of the Hekhalot literature with some of the stuff that we find in the PGM. Of course, there's a famous image here of the PGM from the British Museum featuring this great Ouroboros. One of the things that is conspicuously absent in the Hekhalot literature that we have not seen a great deal of are these characteres. You see these magical symbols here inside of the Ouroboros. These are called characteres. They're very typical of Greek magic. We find them in lots of magic. We also find them in Jewish magic as well. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But these kind of characteres are missing, interestingly enough, from the Hekhalot literature so far as we have it. But one of the elements that we can find as an overlap in the PGM is, of course, spirit adjurations, and the PGM is just full of spirit adjurations. Many different kinds of spirits. Gods are even invoked, so we have lots of different gods, and these are often marked by syncretism. So you might see a spell in the Greek magical papyri that is invoking Helios and Jesus and Aphrodite, right? They again, magic is not a picky art. Magic is a very big tent. Magic is, and so they will invoke all the gods if they need to in order to get the effect. But the adjurations that exist in the Greek magical papyri are marked by what I would call mechanical effect. And by mechanical effect, what I mean is if you do something, something will happen, right? That's very different than, for instance, prayer. Even sort of praying to a god does not mean that God's going to answer your prayer. I'm sure many of us have experienced that. That's very different than the mechanical effect of magic. This is one of the things that you might think of as separating magic and prayer, is that prayer is you asking and then the god has to grant you your prayer. Whereas in magic, it's typically understood to be mechanical. If you burn this root and do this, and this person will fall in love with you, right? But this is the mechanical nature of magic as opposed to something like prayer. Of course, another thing that marks out Greek magic is the use of nomina barbara. So these are often, again, as we've already seen in the Hekhalot literature, these are mysterious strings of letters that are said to have some kind of ritual power. We see them in Greek, and often in the Greek magical papyri, they like palindromes. Some of the palindromes are very elaborate and very long. And so one of the things that they like are palindromes. A couple of distinct palindromes are known from the PGM that they like. As we've already seen in the Hekhalot literature, some of the nomina barbara may have been Greek words originally. In fact, in some of the Greek magical papyri, some of the nomina barbara there are Egyptian words. So we have old Egyptian words that have been corrupted into Greek and being used. Sometimes they're in Hebrew as well. There's a whole range of sacrifices that are often required in the Greek magical papyri as well, along with the use of purifications. And these idea of purifications are be found both in indigenous Egyptian magic, but also in indigenous Jewish magic as well. You can see here some of the characteres. This is a magical amulet recovered from the Cairo Geniza. It's a Jewish amulet, as you can tell, written in Hebrew, and you can see here some of the characteres from these recovered from the Greek, from the Cairo Geniza. What does point out the Greek magical papyri as distinct from the Hekhalot literature is that the Greek magical papyri, as I mentioned, are highly syncretistic. That is to say, you have Jewish, Christian, pagan, Egyptian, Greek elements, Roman elements, all blended together. And these, you'll have Sabaoth being summoned. Sabaoth is a version of the Jewish god in the Greek language. You'll have that god being invoked with Yao, which is another version of the Tetragrammaton, and they'll be invoked right next alongside Zeus or Hecate or something. So it's highly syncretistic in the Greek magical papyri. We do not see that kind of syncretism in the Hekhalot literature. It is overwhelmingly and exclusively Jewish, with the exception maybe of some of those Greek words that end up in the text, but it is not at all syncretizing. It is not syncretizing. So in many ways, we've pointed out just how unusual and perhaps even heterodox the Hekhalot literature is, but the fact that it is resistant to syncretization shows you that it, in some sense, while it remains unusual, it is not unusual in that it syncretizes. So we do not see that kind of element in the text. Now, it may be syncretizing at the level of the ascent technology, right? The ascent technologies may be something that their pagan neighbors are doing, their Christian neighbors are doing, and they're doing a Jewish version of it. But in that sense, it could be syncretizing, but the rituals themselves don't strike me as engaging and syncretizing. So that is, again, shared elements that we do see between the Greek magical papyri, or at least what we might call Eastern Mediterranean late classical magic, which is a mouthful, but in comparison with the Hekhalot literature more generally. But let's drill down a little bit. So let's drill down, starting with some of these ascent technologies, because again, we have to talk about ascent technologies as they intersect with the Hekhalot literature. You're seeing here an example from the Discourse of the 8th and the 9th from Codex 6 of the Nag Hammadi library. This is a kind of vowel song that is meant to be sung by the Hermeticists once they have begun the escape technology or the ascent technology to get up to the Ennead and the Ogdoad. There's a kind of song that you sing. We have it in a vowel notation here in Papyrus 6. But where does this ascent technology ultimately emerge from? The going theory that I've seen that I find to be most persuasive is that it probably has its origins in the Egyptian theory of the afterlife. I don't have to remind folks here that the Israelites never developed a robust theory of the afterlife. The most that they got in the Hebrew Bible is something like Sheol, and Sheol was a place where everyone went, and everyone goes to Sheol, in other words, you're good or you're bad, and it's not a very good place. It's just sort of a gray, dark place of inactivity. It's not heaven or hell. Nothing really goes on there. It's marked by its inertness. And in general, there was an idea that human beings cannot go where God is. That's just not a thing that can happen. But what's interesting is that the Egyptians began to develop two fundamentally important ideas that will dominate the Western imagination. The first of those is the idea of the soul. The Egyptians, so far as we can tell, were one of the earliest people to develop an idea of the soul. And that is the idea that your soul is in fact you, and that element, that thing that individuates you, can survive your death. And so we have this developed early on with in the pyramid texts, and eventually in the coffin texts, and eventually more developed in texts like the Book of Coming Forth by Day. But the idea that what you are can endure your physical death is a watershed moment in the history of the development of Western thought. And further, there is a place where it can go. And that place where it goes is usually referred to as the duat. This is the afterlife. It's sometimes literally thought of as the underneath of the earth, or sometimes you're going into the solar bark, or even a set of circumpolar stars that never set. Depends on what version of the afterlife you're getting in ancient Egypt. Remember, ancient Egypt lasted for 5,000 years as a civilization. And so a lot of development in theology and afterlife theories during that time period. But the idea fundamentally is that the soul can transverse the cosmos. That idea seems to have been grabbed onto by everybody. Everybody really found that idea compelling. Pythagoras found it compelling. Plato found it incredibly compelling. From Plato, the rest of the Western world basically develops this idea that what we are fundamentally is a soul, and that soul can survive our physical death and go dwell somewhere else forever. That idea is all downstream of Plato, basically. It's not an indigenous Israelite idea to be Mesopotamia either, really.
So this is an idea really coming in from the Egyptians, and the Egyptians developed all kinds of tools and techniques by which to navigate that journey. And that journey was increasingly perilous as it developed in Egyptian literature. So we go from a relatively straightforward journey in early pyramid text, where all you have to do is basically escape out of your tomb and then sort of get up to the stars, where by the Book of Coming Forth by Day, sometimes known as the Book of the Dead, there's all kinds of perils one can face. There are lakes of fire. There's all kinds of monsters, and your heart will be weighed by the new kingdom. If you fail that, then a monster named Amit will eat your heart, eat your soul. So it becomes increasingly perilous. And that increasingly perilous afterlife journey is something we see being adopted by various other ascent technologies, whether it's the Gnostics, the Hermeticists, where you have to bypass a great deal of archons on your way out of this planetary archons on the way out of the cosmos. You'll see it developed into way stations in the Eastern Orthodoxy. So this idea had legs. I mean, by legs, I mean it is now the dominant idea in the Western world. You ask almost anybody if they have a soul, they will tell you yes. And if you ask them, will your soul endure after your death? Most people are going to tell you yes. So this is an idea that had legs, and it has become incredibly, incredibly powerful. Now, what we do have is a lot of narratives about how to do this. And what we don't have, and this again is a place where the Hekhalot literature is a bit conspicuous, is we don't have practical guides by which to do this. We have narratives about people doing it, and we have some narratives about why it must be done. We have some narratives about the structure, but we don't have a great deal of narratives about how to actually accomplish that journey. And that's probably just because of the case that a lot of this was recorded orally. This was not recorded in text. You learn this from your teacher, and your teacher was teaching you orally as opposed to you reading in some book. But one notable exception of this is a rather remarkable text called the Hermetic Discourse of the Eighth and the Ninth. This is to be found in Nag Hammadi Codex 6, which is the most unusual of the Nag Hammadi library, in my opinion, Codex 6. This is where we find a copy of Plato's Republic and some various Hermetic texts and things like that. But at any rate, what we do find in this text, in the Discourse of the Eighth and the Ninth, is the record of an ascent journey. And this, the Discourse of the Eighth and the Ninth was pretty clearly written for advanced initiates into Hermeticism. It wasn't meant for newbies. It was definitely meant for advanced students. Maybe one of the most final texts that one would study in the Corpus Hermeticum, in the Hermetic literature. But the Discourse of the Eighth and the Ninth does give us some idea of how one made this journey. And one of the elements, as I spoke about a minute ago, is that one makes this journey through song, that there are hymns that you sing. In this case, there are vowel hymns, right? These are letters, and you would sing these letters. This is to indicate you are to hum this or sing this. We don't know exactly how it was sung, although Vajrahanugraph, in his recent book on Hermetic spirituality, does offer a theory about how he thinks it sounded, which Professor Hanugraph has a background in music. You know, he was in conservatory before he was a badass scholar of Western esotericism. And so he knows music very, very well. And so he offers a theory about how this might have sounded if you check out his book on Hermetic spirituality. But at any rate, this is an insight that we get. Now, again, this overlaps with the Merkavah literature, because as you'll remember, most of the Merkavah Rabbati, that text is just songs. Those are hymns. They are meant to be sung. Now, we don't have any musical notation for them, and we don't know what they would have sounded like, but they were meant to be sung. So again, we have a combination of music and ascent, which again should be unsurprising to us, because if we look at this category of transcultural shamanism, one of the things we find pretty ubiquitous is song, the use of song to induce alterations of consciousness and to pilot oneself into these other worlds. So unsurprisingly, we find an example of song both in the Hermetic literature, but also in the Hekhalot literature as well. One or two really outstanding texts that we should, I think, compare to the Merkavah literature is the first is the Mithras liturgy. The Mithras liturgy is to be found in Greek Magical Papyri 4, that's in the Great Paris Papyrus, from sections 475 to 829. This is a remarkable text. If you ever get the chance to read it, I would highly recommend it. I've made an episode about it on the channel, but a remarkable text and well worth reading. In this liturgy, which invokes Helios Mithras. Now, is this text connected to historical Mithraism? We don't know. Some scholars say yay, some scholars say no, some scholars who are wiser than the others say we have no idea. but there seems to be some connection, at least in terms of the name Mithras is mentioned. But what this text is an ascent praxis, and it is an ascent praxis that promises something remarkable. What it promises is to make one immortal. There is no other text that I know of in the ancient world that promises immortality. The closest thing that promises immortality is Christianity. Christianity is an ascent technology that promises immortality, right? That is the whole point of Christianity. It says, if you do this, you will physically die, but your spirit will ascend, and eventually your body will be reborn, and you will be given a glorified body. So Christianity is a parallel ascent technology that promises immortality of a certain kind. But this one, you achieve immortality in this life, right? And you do it through this Mithras liturgy. So what the way that the text is divided according to Mayer is into two sections. There's a liturgical section and there's a practical section. Again, this should sound a lot like the Hekhalot literature. Typically, the Hekhalot literature gets divided like that as well. So what ends up happening is that you invoke the four elements along with various vocus magici, so various magical words by which you invoke the four elements. And then one begins to visualize oneself rising through the elements. As you'll know, according to Aristotle, all the four elements have a natural place in the universe, earth being the lowest, water above that, air above that, and fire above that. This is why when you drop a steel ball, according to Aristotle, it falls through the air, through the water, and lands at the bottom of the water. That's its natural place. Aristotle and no one else had any concept of gravitation. So if you want to know why fire goes up and lead balls go down, it's because fire's natural place is up, according to Aristotle. So the Mithras liturgy adopts a version of this Aristotelian physics of natural place, and then you visualize traveling through the elements, and then the last one, you imagine yourself levitating. You actually invoke the idea of levitation, and then as you pass upwards through the planetary spheres, you encounter a retinue of very unusual entities. These entities very likely have their origins in Egyptian religious symbolism, but we have planetary deities which guard the gates of heaven. We pass by the sun, who is Helios. We actually pass right by the sun. You meet the seven asp, the snake, asp-faced entities called the Tukai. This is from the Greek word for fate. So you pass through the fates. Then you encounter other entities called the pole lords. These are bull-faced entities called the pole lords. They probably have something to do with astrology. They're probably polar stars. The polar stars are very important in Egyptian astrology because the polar stars never set, and so therefore they're immortal in some sense. Because the circumpolar stars never set, they're thought of as uniquely special in Egyptian astrology before you finally arrive at what they call the highest god. And this text includes all kinds of oral, let us say, spoken sounds that you make, including hissing and popping sounds, which are very unusual. I don't know quite what to make of them, but there are these hissing and popping sounds that you both make and you hear as a cue that you're actually the praxis is working. There are visualizations, there are breathing techniques, there are ointments made from a scarab that you use. There's also a very specific plant that they describe at length called the contritis plant. This contritis plant does something. It's not clear what it does. It may have been a hallucinogenic plant. The contritis plant has never been successfully identified, to my understanding, along with lots of other various kinds of incantation and the use of phylacteries, which is to say various kinds of amulets that you wear on your body to protect you from these various beings that you encounter in this journey. So in a short way of putting it, the Mithras liturgy overlaps in all kinds of ways with the Hekhalot literature. There's lots of points of comparison here. And again, this is why there needs to be a PhD written on this. So there's points of comparison, which is to say you're traveling up through the celestial spheres. You encounter various entities that are in the Mithras liturgy. I wouldn't say that they're hostile, but they're unusual. Fate is one of the entities that you encounter. The fates, that's thought of as a relatively hostile entity in Greek magical thinking. But then there are these visualizations and these incantations. So again, is it the same? No, it's definitely not the same. But is it a ritual device, a ritual praxis for making an ascent to encounter the highest God? Yes. So in that way, the Mithras liturgy is interesting in that in very specific points of comparison, there is clearly an overlap here between the Mithras liturgy and the Hekhalot literature more general. And again, if you've never had the chance to read the Mithras liturgy, you absolutely should check it out. It's a fascinating text. The other text that I think is actually even a better candidate for comparing to the Hekhalot literature are the so-called books of you, or better known by, or should be known by their actual name, the book of the great logos corresponding to the mysteries, which is just a cooler name than the books of you, the book of the great logos corresponding to the mysteries. This is, in my opinion, the most fascinating Gnostic book to have survived from antiquity. I know that's a big claim, because I know there's a lot of people out there that are hardcore fanboys of the Apocryphon of John or the Gospel of Truth or the Gospel of Thomas. Hell, the Gospel of Thomas isn't even esoteric anymore. I mean, National Geographic documentary is about it, and the Gospel of Judas. The books of you and the Pistis Sophia are extremely unusual. And by extremely unusual, I mean they are incomprehensibly complex. They are shockingly complex. I am not easily intimidated by books in general. There are a handful of books that intimidate me. And it took me years to work up the courage to do episodes on the books of you and the Pistis Sophia, because those books are just so intimidating. But what we have in the books of you is a cosmology similar to the Pistis Sophia, which I am not going to detail here. You're welcome to check out my episode on the Pistis Sophia and the books of you. But they involve an incredibly complex cosmology. I would say, I'd argue, it is the most complex cosmology that we know of from this time period. But at the core, it is a praxis for a soteriological spiritual ascent. What is just to say, there is salvation, but the salvation is achieved only if and only if one successfully makes an ascent. And the way that you make the ascent is you have to make the ascent up through the structures of the emanations from the original God. So from the primal unknowing God, that primal unknowing God emanates an entity called you, and JEW, or iota, epsilon, upsilon in Greek. You, this entity you, is the entity that generates the rest of the universe. But this is done through the generation of a great many of the what are called treasuries of light. And these treasuries of light are cosmic structures where you have to navigate them through the use of various passcodes, which you can see some of the passcodes here on the left, and various other kinds of sigils that you can see, for instance, the sigil here. But each one, these are like camps as they're described. Each one is a system of interlocking building, at the center of which is a you being. So this is a micro being of the highest God, and you have to go pass through these, and each one of these is guarded by one of these beings, and you pass through them, you reach the inner you being, and this allows you to pass back to the next one, and there are dozens of these. And so these are the treasuries of light, and these veils are demarcated, as I said, by a series of alphas. Those are alphas. And then these instructions how to part these veils and pass through these on the way up to the realm of what is called the final eternity. And just to give you some idea of these various seals and things, these are some of the various seals of the aeons and the triple power. But every one of these treasury maps has a you emanation and a character for how to basically pass through these structures. So you have to have a special character. You have to know the names of all these different emanations. Typically, there are 12 of them. And then you have to know their names by which to pass through them. And these entities are sometimes referred to as watchers. And their names are all unusual nomina barbara. Typically, they like the Z sound followed by various sets of vowels. And so, again, you get this weird buzzing sound like Zazazoi. That's the name of one of the watchers. Zazio, Uuzai. They seem to be combinations of these the, O, and the and the O sound, a bit like we see in some of the texts in the Hekhalot literature, which are combinations of the Tetragrammaton. Yod, He, Vav, He, just mixed together in all kinds of ways. There's something similar about this, the way that you memorize these beings. Now, there are 60 of these treasuries. Now, we don't know why 60 exactly. That seems to be a number that the ancient Egyptians liked. And so maybe it's a multiple of something. So there's 60 of these treasuries you have to pass. So again, 7 palaces, Hekhalot, doesn't seem so bad anymore. Now we're talking about 60 of these treasuries of light, and each one of them are at least this complex, right? So you can see some of the nomina barbara here of these entities. right? You can see the treasuries here. You have to pass through 60 of these bad boys. And each one requires you to have a seal, have the names. You got to have the names going in and the names going out. It is extremely complicated. Although the manuscript that we have only has 26 of the treasury maps. So, and by the way, this is the only known Gnostic text that's illustrated. None of the other Gnostic texts have illustrations. The books of you were heavily illustrated with 26 of these treasuries. Although as I said, the system requires 60, but only 26 of them are recorded. But you pass through these watchers, you mystically and magically bind to them, and you're able to bypass them on your way up to the highest God. So in many ways, the system of the treasuries found in the books of you, which again, I've made some episodes about, I think are the closest thing in the Western world, of course, and there's lots of things in the Eastern world. But the closest thing that they do, that they appear, right, seems to be something like the Hekhalot literature in the books of you. Those seem to be very similar kinds of ascent technologies with a highly technical aspect about how one transverses these structures. So I would argue that our main comparanda here for the sort of Eastern Mediterranean magical context is the Mithras liturgy and of course and again, not counting the apocalyptic literature, but the Mithras liturgy and the books of you as something like comparanda in that world. I should also mention just very briefly that the system also requires a very complex set of baptisms. There are 3 baptisms, water, fire, and a baptism of Holy Spirit. And all of these baptisms require, and this is before you even begin, these are just qualifying baptisms to begin the U praxis, but these all require various kinds of incense and plants, and all kinds of stones that you have to use as seals, including asbestos and all kinds of stuff. So at any rate, this is an extremely complicated system where you would have to show the cipher with one hand, and then you have to have beads and stuff on the other one. And Jesus would seal you with various seals throughout the various baptisms. And then you get, it's complicated in a way that it's hard to even pin down just how complicated it is. But again, it's something like the praxis that we see in the Sartor literature that requires various kinds of overlaps with, with various kinds of seemingly magic kinds of operations. Of course, we should also compare the magical context, sort of narrowing down from the larger world of the Greek magical papyri, but narrowing down now into the Jewish magical world. Now, one of the least kept secrets in the Jewish world is that Jewish magic is very much a thing. It is well attested. It is well documented. Despite the fact that the Hebrew Bible seems to condemn magic, it is very well attested in the archaeological record. And here's where we have some overlap between the Hekhalot literature and Jewish magic more generally. I just want to go through some of these. The most conspicuous element here, at least in terms of the amulet literature, we have a great deal of amulets, mostly made in lead and silver from this ancient time period. In fact, the earliest piece of the Bible that we've ever recovered is an amulet found in Jerusalem. But we have an amulet here for protection, specifically from demonic affliction. And what's interesting about it is that the amulet seems to associate making an ascent journey, and having made that ascent journey, someone having made that ascent journey. The amulet's fragmentary, but there's an idea that if you make the ascent journey, or someone makes the ascent journey on behalf of you, that can bequeath to you the ability to be resistant to demons. Now, you'll remember that in some of the texts in the Hekhalot literature, it says, say this if you're doing this on your own, but say this if you're doing this for an associate. There is a kind of ascent by proxy. Now, it's very little explored in the Hekhalot literature. We don't really understand much of what's going on there, but there are moments in the text where it's saying, if you are making this ascent by proxy, then do this. So it's very clear that you could have made the descent not for yourself, but to help someone else. This seems to be a place where someone's made the ascent and that they've bequeathed a kind of magical protection to someone in the form of one of these amulets. And what's conspicuous is it mentions the ascent, but also on the amulet is a picture of a ladder. And as you'll remember, right, ladders are, of course, important in the story of the angels going up and down on the ladder of Jacob. But also there is a moment, and I can't remember which Hekhalot text it is, but there is a moment that says that the descender is like one who has a ladder inside their house, right? They can make the ascent anytime they want. And so this image of being able to make the ascent anytime you want via a ladder is also imagery that we see in the Hekhalot literature as well. So this is an amulet that seems to be connected to the Hekhalot literature, connected to the Merkavah praxes in some kind of adjacent way. It's not itself a Merkavah text, but it is a text that seems to be generated out of the Merkavah tradition, where maybe you have a neighbor or an uncle who's a descender, and you can somehow get a spiritual boon from them having made the descent. In much the way that, again, that shamans in other cultures are able to achieve healing for the group through having made one of these mystical journeys. So this may be a place, again, where this is connected. The other literature, of course, is the massive literature of the incantation bowls. The incantation bowls, as I'm sure folks around here will know, were bowls made with incantations, often depicting demons, which were buried upside down, often in the lintel of a house, but sometimes in the room of a house. And those incantation bowls were meant basically to get rid of demons, but they could also do other things as well. The incantation bowl literature is a massive Aramaic literature. In fact, it's second only to the Talmud in terms of its volume. So it is a huge, if you consider it as a literature, it is the largest Jewish Aramaic literature after the Talmud. And if you consider it to be primarily women's literature, which there is a compelling argument to be made that many of these bowls were made by women, that makes it the largest piece of Jewish women's literature in history. So the incantation bowl literature, unfortunately, does not get the respect and the analysis that it deserves. And in fact, more than half of the bowls aren't even translated. So it is a massive literature that is still calls out for work being done on it. But one of the more interesting things about the incantation bowl literature is that it seems to overlap again with the Hekhalot literature, specifically in the personnel involved. Some of the angels that are called on to do the defending from Lilith and other kinds of shadim or ruchot spirits and other kinds of demons, the personnel invoked are very typical of the Hekhalot literature. For instance, we see Michael being invoked, and sometimes Michael is actually even called the Prince of the Torah. He's called the Sar Torah. So Michael is actually being invoked as the Prince of the Torah. We've already seen the Sar Torah in the Hekhalot literature, although in the Hekhalot literature, Michael is never confused as the Sar Torah. The Sar Torah is a distinct angel, distinct from Michael. In fact, Michael doesn't play much of a role at all in the Hekhalot literature. I guess he's off doing other stuff. In general, the archangels, the four big archangels, Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, and Uriel. The fourth one's always a wild card. But the fourth one, depending on which archangels you want, they're not really there much in the Hekhalot literature. But we do see Metatron being invoked quite frequently in the incantation bowl literature. And so Metatron is there. But also conspicuously is Anaphiel, our good buddy Anaphiel. Anaphiel is also mentioned in the literature, in the incantation bowl literature. And so that's, again, a conspicuous place because Anaphiel doesn't really get mentioned in non-Hekhalot literature, but here's a place where in Hekhalot literature and in the incantation bowl literature, Anaphiel gets mentioned as well. One of the really important characters that gets mentioned in the bowl is a certain rabbi named Yehoshua bar Parachia. He is sort of the hero of the incantation bowl literature in the same way that Rabbi Ishmael and other folks, Nakunya ben Hakana, are the guys of the big heroes of the Hekhalot literature. But he is often said to have made an ascent into heaven, and because he's made that ascent into heaven, he has gained magical power over various evil spirits using magical language, especially divine names. So the incantation bowl literature, in a general way, insofar as Yehoshua bar Parachia, who's a very minor figure in the Talmud, most people have never heard of him, but he becomes sort of the hero of the incantation bowl literature, and he becomes the hero of it because he's said to have made a mystical ascent, and because he's made that ascent, he's gained power over the demons. And therefore, in a way, the incantation bowl literature is basically reminding demons of that. Okay, just so you know, Yehoshua bar Parachia made an ascent, and he has power over you, and you can't come in here and bother us. So that's a way that he's invoked as an ascender, right, of having gained this magical power. And of course, we've seen in the Hekhalot literature that one of the powers that one does get, having successfully made the descent or ascent, is that one does get power over demons. So again, is Yehoshua bar Perechia another descender for who we just don't have any literature about? Clearly, the Incantation Bowl literature seems to think of him as something like that, but we don't have a connection. He's not, to my knowledge, he's not mentioned in the Hekhalot literature, but he is mentioned as having made a ascent in the Incantation Bowl literature and gained magical powers, which again is a feature that we do see in the Hekhalot literature more generally. But the exact connection between the Bowl literature and the Hekhalot literature remains, again, the kind of thing that needs to be a monograph. This is one of my favorite amulets, by the way, found in the Greek magical papyri, or rather in the Cairo Geniza. These are anti-scorpion amulets. You'll notice, right, that they begin here. There's a magical triangle, and then there's a picture of a scorpion. You'll notice it repeats over and over and over. These are industrially made. The ritual practitioner just made a whole bunch of them, and they would just sell them. And so this is this sheet is very long, by the way. I'm just only showing you a small portion of it, but it shows you in many ways that this was a business. This guy wrote out a whole bunch of them all at once. I think this is not one of the ones that has a space for a name, but some of them even have an empty space for your name, and they would write your name in, and you would go along your merry way. So yeah, you cut them up, sell them, and it was sort of like in a sort of a cottage industry. So this is one of my favorite amulets that's been recovered from the Cairo Geniza, which is this anti-scorpion amulet. Amulets that are very much just sort of rolling off the assembly line. But of course, the Cairo Geniza is famous for one of the things is that it recovered a great deal of Jewish magical literature. And this Jewish magical literature is really fantastic because it overlaps very conspicuously with the Hekhalot literature, both in terms of the themes of acquiring various kinds of power. We also see a very similar kind of magic using myrtle leaves or leaves blotted with ink and wine, in which you would drink them or wrap them up or wash them away and drink the wine. So that's a very similar a praxis that we find in Masa Merkavah and Merkavah Rabbah. So in many ways, lots of the magical literature recovered from the Cairo Geniza also overlap with Hekhalot literature concerns. And one of them, for instance, is we found a spell in the Cairo Geniza for helping one's memory. And of course, helping one's memory both is a thing that one achieves by doing the Hekhalot literature. You don't forget the Torah learning that you've learned. Prompts the Hekhalot literature in a general way is the fact that people like Nechunya ben Hakana could not remember their Torah, and so they're taught the descent praxis as a means of retaining the Torah. So again, we have this kind of chicken and the egg question when it comes to Torah learning, retention, and memory, but we have a whole spell that's been recovered from the Cairo Geniza to do this as well. There's a fascinating fragment of a spell that mentions Nechunya ben Hakana and self-made bread. And for anyone who knows their Hekhalot literature, you'll know that's tip-off immediately that we know these are descenders, and we know that one of the things that one has to do during the descent praxis is only eat the bread that you yourself have made. And so that's a clear tip-off that spell fragment is in fact somehow connected to the Hekhalot literature more generally. And there are always these little tiny connections, folks. One of them is a curse leaf, and this is a fantastic little spell. It was actually a book plate put into a copy of the Torah, and it was basically, if you steal this, you're going to get cursed. And it promises that if you steal the book, you don't return the book to the library, you'll be cursed with various types of excommunications. You'll be subject to karet. Now, of course, karet is not just, we hear the word karet in excommunication, but in Judaism, it has a sense of God is going to kill you. So it's not just excommunication in a general, it's excommunication from life. And so we have this series of excommunications with a series of nomina barbara. So God's going to do it, and then all these other angels, and then the text descends into nomina barbara. And one of the nomina barbara that we have is this one. Again, how to pronounce this, vocalize this, who knows? But it refers to this entity, and it calls that entity the Prince of the Torah. So Sar Torah. So in that entity also is called the Sar Torah in some Hekhalot texts. So again, we have a curse tablet or a curse document in the Cairo Geniza invoking personnel from the Hekhalot literature. So whoever wrote this curse document knew some of the angels involved in the Hekhalot literature as well. So it's in the air, at least in Cairo. Right. So another one is interesting is that it also involves sort of Sar Torah adjacent styles of fasting and donning clean clothes and very specific prayers, and again the use of Nomina Barbara. But this is for actually doing dream divination. So this is a spell for doing dream divination. You basically fall into a dream, and you can ask angels about the future. But the way that one does it is very similar to the way that one prepares to invoke the Sartora. So again, another place where we have a magical overlap. Another really fascinating text, and this one's, I think, one of the more fascinating ones, is there is a spell for performing the Sotah ritual. Folks may know the Sotah ritual. This is a ritual described in the Hebrew Bible where if a man thinks of his wife as having committed adultery, he can subject her to a ritual in which she's made to eat stuff from the floor of the temple. And if she has committed adultery, then she'll face some kind of horrifying her stomach will fall out. It's not clear exactly what the Hebrew means, but she'll die or something. At any rate, the Sotah ritual, the ordeal of the Sotah is interesting for lots of reasons, but it's interesting because it actually doesn't tell us really how to do it. And one of the things that we find in the Kara Geniza is a ritual for doing the Sotah ritual. Now that's unusual because the Sotah ritual can only be performed in the temple. And of course, by the time that the Kara Geniza is in function, the temple's been destroyed already for many hundreds of years. But at any rate, we find a ritual for performing the Sotah. And one of the things that it invokes is Metatron, the Prince of the Presence. And it specifically mentions that this spell, that this ritual for the Sotah was actually given by Rabbi Ishmael through the mouth of this angel hidden behind the curtain behind the Pargod, and it gives this angel who's mentioned behind the Pargod. So this is a case where we have Rabbi Ishmael giving Sotah praxis from Metatron and from another angel, again denoted here with Nomina Barbara. So another fascinating text from the Kara Geniza that tells us about some connection to the Hekhalot literature more general. We also have other texts of ritual power like the Sheva Zutarti and the Sheva Eliyahu, which are the same text, and also includes adjurations very, very similar to the Hekhalot literature. Finally, the most important text that has been recovered from, magical text recovered from the Kara Geniza, is a text referred to as the Sefer HaRazim, the Book of Secrets. This text was fragmentary until it was put together by Margaliot. And some people wonder about the degree to which he's put it back together. He may have been a little heavy-handed in putting it back together. But at any rate, it represents a late classical Jewish magic grimoire. And in some sense, it is the earliest recovered grimoire in the Western world. So this is an important text just in the history of magic, and the fact that it is one of the earliest recoverable grimoires in the Western world. And we get some sense of the dating for it because it actually mentions things like how to win horse races. And of course, horse races go back to the ancient Roman world and were shut down by the Christians. And so those go back, I think, to like 6th century or something like that. So if you have spells for trying to win horse races, that gives you some sense that this literature probably goes back to the Roman period. So it's an incredibly old grimoire that is found in the Kara Geniza and put back together in the text. So there are interesting overlaps here with the Sefer HaRazim, and which this means the Book of Secrets, and with the Hekhalot literature. The first is material. The same scribe that wrote the copy of the Sefer HaRazim that Margaliot put back together also wrote some of the Geniza fragments of the Hekhalot literature and some astrological documents. So whoever that scribe was, we don't know who it was. He's sometimes referred to as the esotericist because clearly he's interested in this kind of material, astrological material, Hekhalot material, and magical material. So there's just an overlap, a straightforward overlap in terms of the scribe, but further, there's an overlap in terms of the cosmology of the Sefer HaRazim and the cosmology of the Hekhalot literature to a degree. And that is to say, both of them are dominated by the idea that there are 7 heavens, which is not unusual. That's very typical, again, based on the planetary structure of the universe at that time. But what's important is that all of them are thought of as having angelic encampments at every stop, at every firmament. And these encampments the angels of which you learn their names, and by learning their names, you can command them to do various things. So various angels at various encampments are capable of doing different things. So you need to go find the angel at the specific encampment who's good at winning you horse races. And then from that angel, you can learn the horse racing praxis. So basically, you learn where the angels are in the universe, you contact them, and you learn how to do things. And I'll use one of these that is conspicuous. Folks will remember back to when we described the angels of the seventh Hechal, the fearsome angels of the seventh Hechal. Listen to this one. This is the ninth step of the second firmament in the Sefer HaRazim. We're told, these are the ones who stand on the ninth step, forceful ones in valor, flying swiftly in the air. Their might is their dominion, and the likeness of swords is in their hands. They're ready for battle. They grasp a bow. They hold a javelin. They leap higher than fire, and they have horses of fire and juniper. Their chariots are fire, and there is fear of them wherever they turn. I don't know about you, but if you compare that description of the angels of the ninth step of the second firmament of Sefer HaRazim to the angels that we found in the seventh Hechal, covered in blood and fire, the language of burning juniper is also something we've seen already from the transformation of Enoch into Metatron. But at any rate, the idea of the angels arrayed for battle, holding javelins, having horses made of fire, that's language we've already heard in the Hekhalot literature as well. Now, again, what's the connection between the Hekhalot literature and the Sefer HaRazim? We don't know. We don't know what the connection is. But clearly they're imagining very similar heavens. They're imagining heavens dominated by militant, frightening angels. And again, that gives us some idea of an overlap, at least cosmologically, between the cosmology of the Sefer HaRazim and the cosmology of the Hekhalot. Further, the kind of magic that you get from practicing in the Sefer HaRazim is very similar to the kind of boons that you achieve through the Hekhalot mysticism. So you get the same kind of powers, for instance, the ability to know the future, the ability to know people committed sins. You don't get the ability to win horse races in the Hekhalot literature, unfortunately, but you also get the ability, for instance, what's the other one? Oh, I think I said to know the future, but similar kinds of boons that you achieve through the Hekhalot literature. So the magic of the Sefer HaRazim gives you the same kinds of powers that the descenders are said to get. Oh, one of them is to combine letters, right? Both the Hekhalot mystics and the writer of the Sefer HaRazim imagines that you get some kind of specific magical power related to combination of letters. So both of them imagine that to be the case. And of course, the purifications required in the Sefer HaRazim are very similar to those found in the Sar Torah praxis. I should also mention just very briefly here that according to the Sefer HaRazim, this is a book that actually was given by the angel Raziel, which means the secrets of God. It's a fantastic name, to Noah, and then Noah engraved it on a sapphire. And of course, another thing that we should already be, again, for those in the room who are hermetically minded, the idea of some kind of magical text being engraved on a sapphire should immediately call to mind the emerald tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, where this very brief, mysterious document is said to have been written on a piece of emerald. Here we have an entire magical book said to have been written on a sapphire. By the way, we also see similar ideas in Hermetic literature where entire Hermetic texts are said to be written on slabs of turquoise, obelisks of turquoise, in fact. So the idea of writing texts of ritual or magical power on precious and semi-precious gems was an idea that was current in the ancient Eastern Mediterranean, Egypt specifically. But without any doubt, the Hekhalot literature clearly fits into the ecosystem of the world of classical magic and the world of the magic, both of the non-Jewish world, the world of the Greek magical papyri, of which some of those texts are Jewish, but also clearly in the Jewish world as well, from the Babylonian incantation bowl literature to magical texts being pulled out of the Cairo Geniza. Clearly, all of these texts are talking to each other. Now, what those conversations were looking like, we don't know, but they're all connected somehow. How they're connected, we don't know, but they all know about each other and they're all invoking each other. They seem to all know about each other, and yet we don't know how they're connected, either through time, through literature, through scribal practices. But there is some connection, but that connection, of course, remains extremely mysterious to us. And not only that, they all traveled together. All of this literature moved together. It moved from Babylon to Palestine, from Palestine to Egypt. It went back and forth from those two places. It would eventually make its way over North Africa, that's some way over to Morocco. Some of these texts, these magical texts, are found in Yemen. And of course, they would also make their way to Europe, probably via Italy. And eventually, as I mentioned last time, some of this literature, like the Shior is translated ultimately into Latin and put into the Summa Sacra Magici in the 14th century, the most important magical manual written during that time period, maybe the most important magical manual written in the medieval world in many ways. But this is a place where this entire mimetic structure, this entire mysticism, was packaged and moved around. So the question is, when it moves, it's going to eventually move into Provence and into Spain. And when it moves into Provence and into Spain through means that we still don't fully understand, but once it makes its way there, it will encounter a radical shift in Jewish mysticism. Because in the middle of the 13th century, Jews in Provence, like the Iyun circle, the unique cherub circle, which was in Germany, and also then in Zaragoza and other elements in Spain, the Jews in those regions are beginning to respond to Maimonides, as we mentioned last time, in an incredibly forceful way, in a way that is marked by incredible creativity. And those Jews engaging in a novel, radically new form of mysticism are going to pioneer a new form of Jewish mysticism that will in many ways hoover up the Hekhalot mysticism, that will consolidate the Hekhalot mysticism into it, and ultimately produce a new kind of mysticism, which is ironically referred to as the tradition. Of course, in Hebrew, that which is handed down, tradition, is Kabbalah. The Kabbalah will at some level subsume and ultimately overtake Hekhalot literature, Merkavah mysticism, for its pride of place as the dominant form of mysticism in the Jewish world. And so as we come to the end of the course next week, we will have to encounter what I sometimes refer to as the half-life of Merkavah mysticism. Because the Merkavah mysticism never totally goes away. The Shir Koma continues to be printed, continues to be studied. The exegesis on Ezekiel continues to, and there are Merkavah texts built into the most important text of the Kabbalah, the Sefer Zohar. So we shouldn't talk about the end of the Merkavah mysticism. We should talk about its half-life, that it continues to exist subsumed within the world of the Zohar, subsumed in the world of the Sefer Bahir, subsumed into the world of the Sfirot. So the question is, just what kind of half-life is the Merkavah mysticism going to have in the context of its half-life in the Kabbalah? And so next week, we will turn to that half-life, a half-life which continues all the way down to this day, where you can still walk into a Haredi bookshop in Brooklyn and buy a copy of Sefer Hekhalot. It's still there. Where inside of Jewish liturgical practices, to this day, Merkavah texts persist. So we will find that the Kabbalah doesn't destroy Merkavah mysticism. The Kabbalah becomes a conduit for Merkavah mysticism to survive in a deeply esoteric, deeply underground way. And here at the end of the course, we come to the twilight and to the half-life of the descent to the chariot. And I'll see folks next week as we wrap up our exploration of the Descenders.